Story 1. My name is John, and I'm a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park. I've worked here for over 15 years and have seen some bizarre things, but nothing quite as strange as the encounter I had last summer. It was a warm July evening, and I was doing my usual evening patrol of the backcountry trails. As I hiked along the ridge overlooking the valley, I noticed movement down below. At first, I thought it was an elk or bear, but as I looked closer, I saw something that made my heart jump. There was a tall, skinny, humanoid-looking creature crawling on all fours among the trees. It had extremely long, spindly limbs and was hairless, with skin that looked almost translucent. The thing that really gave me chills was the oversized head and bulging black eyes. It moved unlike anything I'd ever seen, with odd contortions as it wove between the trees. I froze, not wanting to startle the creature or provoke any aggression. I pulled out my binoculars to get a better look. It was humanoid in form, but far too thin, and the proportions were all wrong. The head sat directly on its shoulders, no visible neck. I estimate it stood at least 7 feet tall if upright. The face was devoid of any features besides the eyes. As I watched, the creature suddenly turned and looked directly at me, as if it sensed I was there. A bolt of fear shot through me when our eyes met. The black orbs seemed to stare right through me. We remained frozen for a few moments before the creature scurried away at an inhuman speed, its limbs twisting wildly as it disappeared into the forest. I hastened back to the ranger station, heart pounding. I told my supervisor what I saw, but he seemed skeptical. He said it was likely a starving bear standing upright, but I know bears. This was no bear. I don't know what this thing was, but it continues to haunt my dreams. I still patrol the area hoping to catch another glimpse, though part of me hopes I never come across that creature again. My encounter left me shaken to my core. There are things in those woods that defy explanation, and we would be wise to treat such places with respect and caution. Story 2. I decided to take a solo camping trip to Yellowstone National Park to get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. I've always felt a deep connection to nature and love spending time outdoors, so I couldn't wait to spend a few days immersed in the wilderness. After setting up my tent at the campground, I set out on a hike to see some of the park's famous geysers. The hissing steam and bubbling pools were amazing to see up close. As the sun began to set, I headed back to my campsite to get a fire going and cook some dinner. That's when things started getting strange. As I was gathering firewood, I heard some odd noises coming from the tree line nearby. It sounded almost like a hissing growl. I paused to listen more closely. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as the growling continued. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. Gripping my hatchet tightly, I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" No answer. The growling suddenly stopped. I quickly got a fire going, hoping that would scare off whatever was lurking in the shadows. As I heated up some canned chili for dinner, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was watching me just out of view. The woods surrounding my campsite were deathly silent. Even the crickets and owls seemed to have quieted down. I decided to turn in early that night, exhausted from my hike. As I settled into my sleeping bag, the strange noises returned, closer and more menacing than before. My blood turned to ice as I listened intently. The gravelly growls and hisses were interspersed with disturbing clicking noises, almost like claws scraping against rock. This was definitely not a bear or mountain lion. I was paralyzed with fear, afraid to even reach for my flashlight. After what felt like hours, the noises faded away, and I somehow managed to fall into a fitful sleep. At dawn, I eagerly packed up camp, wanting to get out of those woods as fast as possible. As I was stuffing my gear into my pack, I noticed a weird, musky scent lingering near the edges of my campsite, almost like sulfur. I also spotted several trees with unusual claw marks shredded deep into the bark. They looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. Long, jagged slashes over 6 feet off the ground. I wasted no time hitting the trail back to my car, constantly peering over my shoulder for any sign of what stalked my campsite last night. The parking lot couldn't come into view fast enough. As I sped out of Yellowstone, my mind kept replaying the eerie sounds of scraping claws and sinister hissing. I'm not sure what I encountered out there in the darkness, but I have no desire to ever find out. I'll be sticking to day hikes from now on. Something very strange and dangerous lurks in those woods once the sun goes down. Story 3. It was the fall of 2022, and I was deer hunting in Yellowstone National Park. I had scouted out a nice spot in the northwest corner of the park that I thought would be promising for bagging a big buck. The area was fairly remote with thick forest cover, perfect habitat for deer. I set up my tree stand about 15 feet off the ground on a Thursday morning. The weather was clear and crisp, ideal conditions for hunting. As I settled into my stand, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the forest was. No birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush from small animals, just silence. It gave me an uneasy feeling, like I was being watched. After about an hour, I caught some movement in the trees to my left. I slowly turned my head and lifted my binoculars to get a better look. That's when I saw it. At first it looked like a large elk moving through the woods, but something was off. This thing shimmered and wavered, like it was made of liquid. I could make out the general shape and mass of a large animal, but the edges were blurred as if out of focus. I watched this strange, shimmering creature lumber between the trees for several minutes. It seemed to vanish completely whenever it stopped moving. The sight filled me with dread. My instincts told me this was something unnatural, something dangerous. As the sun moved lower in the sky, I decided I'd had enough. I carefully climbed down from my stand and hiked back to my truck as quickly as I could. I drove back to my cabin and didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. To this day, I still wonder what that creature was. All I know is it wasn't any elk or deer. It was supernatural, and it still haunts my memories. After that day, I never hunted in that part of Yellowstone again. Story 4. It was a crisp autumn evening when my dad and I decided to take a weekend camping trip to Yellowstone National Park. We had just left the general store with some supplies and were walking back to our campsite when we heard a strange cry in the distance. It sounded like a human baby wailing, but there was something off about it. My dad stopped in his tracks and whispered, "Look over there." He was pointing towards a large oak tree across the dirt road. Perched on a low-hanging branch was a dark, thin figure staring right at us. It had huge bat-like wings folded behind its back and a long, pointed tail that whipped around with interest. But the most disturbing feature was its eyes, 2 large glowing orbs burning bright crimson red. I was paralyzed with fear as those devilish eyes bored into mine. Dad started reciting Hail Marys under his breath, praying we'd be spared by this beast. Just then, the creature unfurled its massive wings and let out an ear-piercing shriek. My blood turned to ice in my veins. We sprinted towards our car and dove inside as the winged demon took flight and circled overhead. Its leathery wings made a whooshing sound as it hovered above our campsite. Dad jammed the keys in the ignition and tore off down the dirt road as the creature pursued us from above. It flew alongside the car, scratching at the windows and screeching violently. After what felt like an eternity, it veered off into the darkness of the forest. We drove straight to the ranger station and reported our frightening encounter. The rangers believed us, saying there had been other sightings of a winged humanoid in the area lately. We cut our camping trip short and sped home, rattled to our cores. I'll never forget that night or the chilling cry of that beast. The glowing red eyes still haunt my dreams from time to time. Needless to say, we haven't been camping in Yellowstone since. Story 5. My name is Dennis, and I'm a seasoned outdoorsman who loves exploring national parks. Last summer, I decided to take a solo backpacking trip through Yellowstone. I planned a 10-day route that would take me along the southern loop of the park, camping at different backcountry sites each night. The first few days of my trip went smoothly. I saw amazing scenery, wildlife, and otherworldly geothermal features. By the 5th day, I was deep in the backcountry and hadn't seen another person for over 24 hours. That afternoon, I set up my camp in a clearing near Shoshone Lake. As the sun was setting, I was cooking dinner when I heard an eerie, unnatural howling sound emanate from the forest about 100 yards away. It sounded like a cross between a wolf and a bear, but with odd guttural undertones that sent a chill down my spine. I stopped what I was doing and scanned the tree line, looking for the source of the bizarre howls. The howling continued, moving closer and closer to my campsite. I felt the hair on my neck stand up as fear crept through me. Gripping my camping knife tightly, I backed up towards a large pine tree and prepared for whatever was approaching. Suddenly, the brush parted and out walked a creature that looked like nothing I've ever seen before. It was about the size of a large wolf, but walked upright on 2 legs. It had muscular hindquarters like a feline and huge clawed paws. But the most striking and terrifying feature was its head. It looked reptilian and hairless, with bulging oval eyes set wide apart and rows of jagged teeth protruding from its mouth. The creature locked its eyes on me and let out a menacing hiss. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity before it turned and ran back into the forest as quickly as it had appeared. The unnatural howls soon faded into the distance. I was left shaken, with my heart pounding in my chest. I broke camp immediately and hiked through the night, too afraid to sleep. I told the rangers about what I had seen when I emerged from the backcountry 2 days later, but they chalked it up to exhaustion and imagination. But I know what I saw out there in the Yellowstone backcountry. It was real, and it's out there still, haunting the remotest parts of that untamed landscape. I'll never venture into Yellowstone alone again. Story 6. For years, I had dreamed of visiting Yellowstone National Park, and this past summer, I finally made the trip. I planned a multi-day backpacking excursion along the Nez Perce Trail, heading south from the West Thumb area down to Shoshone Lake. The first couple days of hiking were amazing. I saw beautiful meadows, thermal pools, and all kinds of wildlife. On the 3rd day, I reached my campsite near the south shore of Shoshone Lake. After setting up my tent, I decided to do some fishing before sunset. I walked about a half-mile down the shoreline until I reached a nice spot overlooking a bay. I cast my line a few times, not having much luck. Just as I was about to reel in and try a new lure, there was suddenly a huge splash about 100 feet from shore. I looked over expecting to see a fish, but instead caught a brief glimpse of a large serpentine form sliding back under the water. It created waves at least 3 feet high as it submerged. My heart was pounding as I stared out over the now calm bay. The creature, whatever it was, did not resurface. I quickly gathered my gear and rushed back to my campsite. I barely slept that night, wondering if the creature was still lurking nearby. In the morning, I broke camp early and continued my hike, occasionally scanning the lake for any signs of movement. I told the park rangers about my encounter when I finished my hike. They said sightings of strange creatures were not unheard of in Yellowstone. I'll never know for sure what I saw, but I know it wasn't any ordinary fish or lake monster. Something truly bizarre lives in those deep waters, and it's an experience I'll never forget. Story 7. I'm writing to you about a strange experience my family and I had last month in Yellowstone National Park. We were driving through the park late at night after a long day of sightseeing. As we entered a wooded area, my wife suddenly said she saw odd flashing lights coming from the forest. I pulled the car over and shut off the headlights so we could get a better look. Within a couple minutes, 4 tall, slender humanoid figures emerged from the trees. Though it was dark, I could make out their general shape, but no distinguishing features. They seemed to glide more than walk. My 2 young kids were terrified and started screaming in the back seat. Then the figures suddenly vanished right before our eyes. We hightailed it out of there, my heart pounding the whole time. I've replayed the scene in my mind over and over. I don't know what those beings were, but there was something eerie and otherworldly about them. Have you received any similar reports in that area? This experience has me shaken, and I'd appreciate any insight you may have. Please let me know if you need any other details. Story 8. It was the summer of 2001, and I was 16 years old on a road trip with my family. We were driving through Yellowstone and decided to stop at one of the geyser basins to do some hiking. It was late afternoon, and the place was fairly empty. As we walked along the boardwalk trail, I started to get an uneasy feeling like someone was watching us. I looked around, but didn't see anyone. Then out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a tall, slender figure standing behind a tree about 30 feet away. He was just standing completely still, staring right at us. I alerted my family and pointed to where he was. As soon as we all looked over, he darted behind the tree and out of view. My dad suggested we start heading back to avoid any trouble. As we turned to leave, I glanced back and saw the figure peek out from behind the tree again. By now, I could tell he had extremely pale skin and was wearing some kind of black cloak. We picked up our pace, but the parking lot was still a ways away. That's when I heard footsteps running up behind us. My mom screamed as this terrifyingly tall, pale man suddenly appeared on the trail right next to us. He had no facial features and was making awful screeching noises. We broke into a sprint towards the lot. The creature kept pace with us easily, lurching in an unnatural way. As we neared the end of the trail, it let out a bone-chilling wail and vanished into the trees. We jumped in our car and peeled out of there like bats out of hell. To this day, I have no idea what that thing was, but it still haunts my nightmares. I'll never set foot in Yellowstone again after that. Story 9. My friends and I decided to take a road trip to Yellowstone National Park for a camping weekend getaway. We loaded up my SUV with our tents, sleeping bags, and enough food and beer to last us a few days out in the wilderness. The drive from our homes in Salt Lake City to the park took several hours, but we finally arrived at our campsite in the late afternoon. We quickly set up our tents and got a fire going before the sun started to set. As darkness fell over the campgrounds, we drank beers and roasted hot dogs and marshmallows over the crackling fire. Around midnight, we were all feeling tired, so we put out the fire and headed to our tents to get some sleep. I crawled into my sleeping bag, but tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep right away. My tent was near the edge of the campsite, closest to the woods. As I was laying there with my eyes closed, I started to hear strange noises coming from the trees. It sounded like heavy footsteps trampling over branches and underbrush. I sat up and strained my ears, trying to figure out what could be making that noise. It didn't sound like a bear or mountain lion to me. As the footsteps got closer, I realized there were two distinct sets, like something bipedal was approaching. My heart began racing as the steps came nearer. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to make a sound. Suddenly, I heard a horrendous screeching howl echo through the woods that made my blood turn to ice. Scrambling out of my tent, I scanned the tree line with my flashlight. That's when I saw them. Two pale, hairless creatures crouched by the bushes at the edge of the campsite. They looked to be at least 8 feet tall with sickly white skin that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Their limbs were unnaturally long and spindly, with elongated arms that almost reached the ground. Their heads were oval-shaped and sat directly on their shoulders without a noticeable neck. Dark, sunken eyes reflected in my flashlight beam as the creatures stared back at me. One of them opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It unleashed another bone-chilling shriek that jolted me into action. I sprinted across the campsite, screaming at the top of my lungs to wake my friends. The creatures snarled as we all stumbled out of our tents, scrambling to pack up our gear. My friends were frozen in shock and horror when they saw the pale humanoid beasts watching us from the tree line. We hurriedly threw everything into the back of my SUV, not even bothering to take down our tents. I jumped into the driver's seat, threw the vehicle in gear, and hit the gas pedal hard. The tires spit up dirt and rocks as I sped out of there like a bat out of hell. My friends all cried out in alarm as the creatures pursued us into the road on all fours before giving up the chase. We drove until sunrise, not stopping until we reached the gates of the park. I have no idea what those creatures were, but the image of their gaunt, pale bodies and dark, soulless eyes is seared into my brain. We reported the encounter to park rangers, but they claimed nothing has ever been spotted like what we described. Since that night, I refused to camp anywhere near the woods. Those gangly humanoid beasts still haunt my nightmares. I'll never feel safe in the darkness of the wilderness again after what we witnessed in Yellowstone. Story 10. I was hiking in Yellowstone National Park last summer when I had an incredible encounter. I grew up camping and hiking all over the Rocky Mountains, so I'm very familiar with wildlife. But what I saw that day was no ordinary animal. I was on a trail up to Observation Peak. It was late afternoon and I hadn't seen many other hikers that day. As I came around a bend, I noticed some movement up ahead. At first, I thought it was a bear, but as I got closer, I realized it was something much stranger. This creature was hunched over, digging at the ground. It was covered in reddish-brown fur and stood at least 8 feet tall on 2 legs. The face looked like a bizarre mix between a dog and an ape. The ears were pointy and it had a long snout with huge fangs poking out. I froze in my tracks, not believing what I was seeing. This was no bear or mountain lion. It looked like a werewolf or Dogman straight out of a horror movie. As I stood there stunned, the creature suddenly stopped digging and snapped its head towards me. We made direct eye contact, and a chill went down my spine. The eyes were an eerie yellow color and full of intelligence. We stared at each other for a few tense moments before the creature let out a low, threatening growl. The hair on the back of its neck stood up as it bared its fangs. I knew I had to get out of there. I slowly began backing up the way I came, trying not to make any sudden movements. The creature watched me the whole time, growling softly. As soon as I felt I was a safe distance, I turned and ran as fast as I could down the trail. I didn't dare look back until I reached my truck in the parking lot. I jumped in and tore out of there, my heart racing. I reported the sighting to park rangers, but they found no traces of the creature when they searched the area. I'll never forget coming face to face with that wolf-like beast. I'm convinced it was a dogman or werewolf. Nothing else can explain what I saw that day in Yellowstone. My encounter proves that monsters like that really do exist in remote wilderness areas. I'll certainly be more cautious hiking in the future. Story 11. Last summer, my wife and I decided to take a road trip across the western United States to celebrate our 10th anniversary. We rented an RV and made plans to visit several national parks, including Yellowstone. The first couple days in Yellowstone were amazing. We saw incredible wildlife and landscapes. On our third day, we stopped at the Old Faithful gift shop and restaurant area while waiting for the next eruption. I went inside to grab a snack while my wife waited outside. As I was waiting in line, I noticed a teenage boy standing nearby, staring at me. He looked about 16 years old, with very pale skin and jet black eyes. Something about him gave me the creeps, so I tried not to make eye contact. But every time I glanced over, he was still glaring right at me with those dark, soulless eyes. I paid for my food and got out of there as quick as I could. When I told my wife about it, she joked that I had seen one of the men in black that conspiracy theorists talk about. I laughed it off, but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. That night, as we were sleeping in the RV, I woke up suddenly drenched in sweat. I had a raging fever that spiked to 104 degrees. My wife wanted to drive me to the hospital right away, but after 15 agonizing minutes, the fever mysteriously vanished. I was completely exhausted, as if the life had been drained out of me. Over the next few days, I felt weak and tired, but my strength eventually returned. We even had blood work done at a clinic in Bozeman, Montana, on our way home, but it came back normal. To this day, I still wonder if that creepy black-eyed kid had something to do with my bizarre illness. I'll never forget those cold, inhuman eyes staring a hole right through me. Story 12. My friend Matthew and I took a road trip to Yellowstone. We were recent college grads looking to unwind after 4 stressful years of tests and term papers. Our plan was to spend a week camping and hiking in the park, taking in the incredible scenery and wildlife. We arrived at our campsite on a sunny Monday afternoon. It was in a remote area of the northwest corner of the park where we hoped to avoid the biggest crowds. We spent the first couple days exploring nearby trails and fishing at a small, quiet lake. On our third day, we decided to take a day hike up to Avalanche Peak. We got a late start that morning after sleeping in and didn't hit the trail until almost noon. It was a warm, cloudless day, and we made our way slowly up the steep trail, stopping frequently for water and snacks. We reached the summit around 3 p.m. The views were incredible, looking out over the vast wilderness of Yellowstone. We sat on top of the peak resting and enjoying the scenery before starting our descent. That's when things started to get strange. As we headed down from the peak, the weather began to change rapidly. Dark clouds rolled in, and it quickly became foggy and cold. We could barely see 20 feet in front of us. I checked my phone, but there was no service this deep in the wilderness. We had planned to be down before sunset, but now we would be hiking the last few miles in darkness. We moved as quickly as we could, but the fog just kept getting thicker. We could hear strange noises all around us, howls and shrieks that seemed to come from every direction. At one point, I swear I saw a dark figure dart between the trees off to our left. Matt didn't see it and said I was just seeing things in the fog. But then about a mile from the trailhead, we both saw it. A massive, wolf-like creature standing on its hind legs right in the middle of the trail. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, covered in shaggy black fur. Its eyes seemed to glow yellow in our headlamp beams as it stared back at us, unmoving. The sounds we had been hearing in the fog now turned to loud, guttural growls. Matt and I were frozen in fear. This was no ordinary wolf or bear. We had heard the old Native American legends about supernatural creatures roaming this part of Yellowstone, but hadn't believed them until now. The beast snarled, baring its sharp fangs. Matt's screaming snapped me out of my terrified trance, and we both turned and ran faster than I knew was humanly possible. The creature didn't pursue us, but the horrific sounds of its snarling followed us all the way back down to the trailhead. We burst out of the woods just as the last light faded from the sky, collapsed in a heap by the car, unable to speak. It took us hours to calm down enough to even drive back to our campsite. We left Yellowstone the next morning, cutting our trip short by several days. Neither of us wanted to spend another night in those woods. I'll never go back to that part of Yellowstone again. We returned home knowing that there are some mysteries and creatures in this world that can't be explained. Story 13. I'll never forget the strange events that transpired during my trip to Yellowstone a few years back. I had decided to take a solo camping trip to unwind from the stresses of daily life. I booked a campsite at Bridge Bay Campground and set off on the long drive, looking forward to communing with nature. After setting up my tent and gear, I went for an evening hike along the shore of Yellowstone Lake. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow over the rippling water. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I glanced around nervously, but saw no one. I quickened my pace to return to camp before dark. When I arrived, something immediately seemed off. My tent flap was wide open, even though I distinctly remembered zipping it closed. I cautiously peered inside with my flashlight. That's when I saw them, a pair of glowing yellow eyes staring back at me from the shadows. I stumbled backwards and scanned the beam around, but there was nothing there. Uneasy, I retreated to my car and decided to sleep there for the night instead. As I drifted off, I couldn't stop thinking about those eerie eyes watching me. The next morning, I woke feeling anxious. Had it just been my imagination? Still, I couldn't shake the ominous feeling that had settled over me. After packing up my gear, I drove to the Grand Prismatic Spring to take my mind off things. While walking along the boardwalk, I noticed a park ranger waving people back frantically. As I drew closer, I saw why. One of the tourists had apparently wandered off the designated path and fallen into the scalding hot spring. By the time they pulled his body out, it was burned beyond recognition. The whole grisly scene left me feeling nauseous. I decided to leave the park early, no longer comfortable being there alone. As I walked to my car, I swore I heard something breathing heavily behind me. I spun around, but once again there was nothing. I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and tore out of there. The entire drive home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, unable to escape the feeling of being stalked. To this day, I have no idea what happened on that trip. But something sinister lurks within the beautiful facade of Yellowstone. I'll never set foot there again. Story 14. My friends and I were on a camping trip in Yellowstone National Park last summer. We had backpacked deep into the back country, at least 15 miles from the nearest road or trailhead. On our third day, we set up camp alongside a small creek in a forested area. That night, as we sat around the campfire telling stories, we heard some odd vocalizations from the forest around us. They sounded like a cross between an owl hooting and a baby crying. We figured it must be some kind of unusual bird or other animal, so we didn't think too much of it. The next day, we continued hiking north towards our intended destination. As the trail wound through dense forest, I caught a glimpse of something tall and hairy walking behind a tree about 50 yards away. It disappeared before I could get a good look, but it seemed to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. I told my friends what I had seen, but they just laughed it off as my imagination playing tricks. A couple hours later, we stopped to filter some water from a stream crossing the trail. We were kneeling down, filling our bottles, when we heard crashing through the brush upstream. Expecting to see an elk or bear, we instead saw a massive, hairy bipedal creature come down to the water's edge, not 30 feet from us. It had reddish-brown hair covering its entire body except the face, which was dark black. It leaned down to scoop up water in its huge hands, seemingly oblivious to our presence just across the stream. We sat there frozen in shock, watching it drink for a good 20 seconds before it turned and strode back into the forest. As soon as it was out of sight, we frantically packed up and got back on the trail, hiking several more miles before stopping to camp, constantly looking over our shoulders for any sign of the creature. We cut our trip short and headed out of the back country the next day, reporting the encounter to the park rangers on our way out. They told us it sounded like we had seen a Bigfoot, which are occasionally sighted in the Yellowstone wilderness, though the Park Service doesn't formally acknowledge their existence. Needless to say, we will think twice before camping so deep in the backcountry there again. The sheer size and power of that thing was terrifying to behold up close. The following year, I returned to Yellowstone with a couple of friends who were visiting from out of state. They wanted to see some of the iconic geyser basins and wildlife, like bison and elk. We were hiking along the boardwalks in the lower geyser basin one afternoon when I noticed a dead bison calf about 30 yards off the trail. It looked like it had been partially eaten by predators. As I was pointing it out to my friends, a giant winged creature suddenly rose up from the carcass, flapping its wings. It had a wingspan of at least 12 feet, ragged brown fur covering its body, and a face that resembled a bat or monkey. We watched in shock as it snatched up the bison carcass in its clawed feet and flew off over the trees to the south. Based on its characteristics, it seemed to match eyewitness descriptions of giant bats or pterosaurs that have been reported in the park. Seeing something like that, which should have been extinct for millions of years, really shook my sense of reality. My most recent strange experience in Yellowstone happened just this past spring. I was hiking along the south rim of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, admiring the lower falls far below. As I was taking pictures of the canyon, I noticed what looked like a huge snake curling in and out of holes in the cliff face about 200 feet down from the trail. This thing was thick as a tree trunk and nearly 50 feet long from what I could see. I managed to get a couple photos of it before it retreated into a cave and out of view. The park rangers told me it was likely an ancient relic snake species that somehow survived in the deepest parts of the Yellowstone ecosystem. Between that, the Bigfoot, and the pterosaur thing, I'm starting to wonder if there might be a lost world of prehistoric creatures hiding in Yellowstone's remote backcountry. Story 15. It was the summer of 1999, and my cousin Edward and I decided to take a road trip to Yellowstone for a camping vacation. We loaded up my old Jeep Wrangler and headed out from our hometown in Kansas City, Missouri. The drive went smoothly, and we arrived at the park late in the afternoon. We set up camp at one of the first-come, first-served campgrounds and settled in for the night. The next day, we explored some of the iconic geyser basins and saw Old Faithful erupt. In the evening, we grilled up some burgers at our campsite and turned in early, exhausted from a full day of hiking. That's when things started to get strange. I awoke suddenly in the middle of the night to a bizarre shrieking sound, like nothing I had ever heard before. It sounded like a cross between an eagle's cry and a mountain lion's growl, echoing through the dark forest surrounding our camp. I sat bolt upright in my tent, my heart pounding. After a few minutes, the shrieks faded away. I laid back down uneasily, wondering what creature could have produced such an unearthly cry. The next morning over breakfast, I asked Edward if he had heard the strange noises. His eyes got wide and he nodded. "Dude, that scared the crap out of me," he said. "It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie." We agreed to keep our eyes peeled and ears open for anything else unusual. Later that day, while hiking along the Madison River, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I had the distinct feeling we were being watched from the woods. Edward must have sensed it too, because he whispered, "Let's get out of here," and picked up his pace. As we hurried back to the trailhead, I risked a glance over my shoulder and noticed a dark shape flitting between the trees behind us. It looked like a large, hunched-over creature bounding on all fours, keeping pace with our retreat. We didn't slow down until we reached the Jeep. Edward's hands were shaking as he turned the key in the ignition. "What the hell was that thing?" he asked breathlessly. I just shook my head, at a loss for words. We returned to camp on edge, constantly scanning the forest for any signs of the mysterious creature. But the rest of the trip was thankfully uneventful. On the long drive home, Edward and I tried to make sense of what we had experienced. The eerie shrieks, the unseen watcher in the woods, the hulking dark shape trailing us. What was going on in Yellowstone? We vowed to keep it between us, fearing we'd be ridiculed if we ever told anyone. Over the years, we've occasionally brought up those bizarre events again, but never arrived at any rational explanation. To this day, Yellowstone holds a creepy mystique for me. Sometimes I still wonder what cries in the night within those dark primordial forests. Story 16. Last summer, my buddy Dale and I decided to go on a camping trip in Yellowstone. We've both been big outdoor enthusiasts since high school and try to go on a trip together at least once a year. This time, we chose Yellowstone because neither of us had been before and we heard it was beautiful. We flew into Jackson Hole, rented a car, and drove to the Yellowstone South entrance. After stopping at the Visitors Center to grab a map, we headed up to Canyon Village and found a nice campsite. We spent the first day hiking along the north rim of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. The views were absolutely breathtaking. On our second day, we decided to check out the Norris Geyser Basin. We hiked along the boardwalks and were amazed by all of the thermal features. Steamboat Geyser even erupted while we were there, which I guess doesn't happen too often. After Norris, we drove up to Mammoth Hot Springs and took in the incredible travertine terraces as the sun set. The next morning, we packed up camp and drove up to our final destination, Lamar Valley. We had heard it was one of the best places to see wildlife in the park. Almost immediately after arriving, we spotted tons of bison, pronghorn, and even a grizzly bear in the distance. We found a place to park alongside the road and sat on a hill overlooking the valley, taking in the beautiful scenery and keeping our eyes peeled for more animals. After an hour or so, Dale tapped me on the shoulder and pointed toward a group of trees about 200 yards away. I looked closely and could barely make out a large, dark figure lurking among the pines. At first, I thought it must be a bear, but as I continued watching, I realized it was standing upright on two legs. It was covered in dark brown hair and stood at least 7 or 8 feet tall. "Is that a Bigfoot?" I whispered to Jason. He just nodded silently, not taking his eyes off the creature. We watched, stunned, as it slowly ambled through the trees, stopping occasionally to scratch its back on a trunk or snap off a branch. We didn't even think to grab our cameras. We were so mesmerized by what we were seeing that we just sat frozen in disbelief. After about 10 minutes, the Bigfoot wandered deeper into the forest and out of view. Jason and I looked at each other, both of our jaws hanging open. "That was definitely a Sasquatch," Jason finally said. "No doubt about it." I agreed. The size, the gait, the hair all matched the descriptions we had heard. But neither of us had actually believed we would encounter one. We debated telling the rangers, but ultimately decided against it. We didn't get any photographic evidence after all. Still, we'll remember that incredible experience in Yellowstone for the rest of our lives. I guess we were two of the lucky few to actually see a Bigfoot in the wild. Story 17. I was hiking in Yellowstone National Park last week when I heard the strangest noises coming from the woods. At first, it sounded like a wolf howling, but then it shifted into more of a scream. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized this was no ordinary animal. The noises continued on and off for the next few days as I explored more of the backcountry trails. I asked some of the other hikers if they had heard anything unusual, but most just shook their heads. It wasn't until I was setting up my campsite near Canyon Village that things took a sinister turn. I had just started a fire when I heard crunching leaves and turned to see glowing eyes staring at me from the tree line. I fumbled for my bear spray with shaking hands as the creature stepped forward into the firelight. At first glance, it looked like a large coyote, but something about it seemed off. It moved with an unnatural gait, and its proportions just didn't seem right, with powerful hind legs and an overly large head. As it bared its teeth at me, I noticed they were jagged and sharp. This was no coyote. I was face to face with a nahual. I had heard the legends of these shapeshifters from the Native American tribes in the area. They were said to be evil sorcerers who could transform into various animal forms and bring harm to humans. I held my breath as the nahual circled my camp, its eyes reflecting the firelight. Just when I thought it would lunge, a park ranger pulled up in his truck. The nahual quickly loped off into the darkness. I tried to explain what I saw, but the ranger just chuckled and said it was probably just a curious coyote. But I knew what I saw. Over the next week, I heard more chilling noises around my campsite each night. Twice I woke to find animal tracks surrounding my tent that didn't seem to belong to any creature I could identify. I started taking precautions like hanging dream catchers and protective fetishes around my site, but still the nahual continued to stalk me. Finally, one night it attacked. I was woken by the sound of scratching on the tent, and before I could react, a claw sliced through the nylon near my face. I leapt out of the tent, grabbing my bear spray and a log from the fire to use as a torch. There in front of me was the hulking coyote creature, snarling and snapping its jaws. I let loose with the bear spray, causing the beast to yelp and stagger back. I advanced, waving the flaming log, causing it to retreat further into the woods. It let out one final, unearthly howl before disappearing into the night. The next morning, I broke camp and got the hell out of Yellowstone, rattled by my close encounter with the nahual. I'll never view the park the same way again, knowing there are shape-changing creatures even more frightening than bears or wolves that stalk the remote wilderness. My advice for future hikers: stick to the main trails and bring some supernatural protection, just in case. Story 18. I've always loved the serenity of the outdoors, and Yellowstone is one of my favorite places to hike and camp. I arrived mid-afternoon and set up my tent at a small campground near the south entrance. After getting settled in, I took a short hike to stretch my legs before the sun went down. As the sky started to darken, I headed back to my campsite to start a fire and cook dinner. I was exhausted from the drive and hike and quickly fell asleep in my tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange, shrill, screeching sound. unlike anything I've ever heard before. It seemed to be coming from the woods not far from my tent. I laid there paralyzed, listening intently. The screeching continued on and off for several minutes. My heart was racing as I tried to rationalize what could be making such an eerie, unearthly sound. After gathering my courage, I slowly unzipped my tent and peeked outside. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary in the moonlit woods. Then suddenly, I noticed a dark figure silhouetted against the night sky, slowly drifting between the trees. It looked like a human form, but it was floating effortlessly several feet off the ground. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief as it moved closer, still screeching intermittently. As it approached the edge of my campsite, I could make out more details in the moonlight. It looked like a humanoid creature about 7 feet tall, dressed in a robe-like black shroud that wrapped its entire body, leaving only its hands and hooded head exposed. The hands appeared to have long, slender fingers that ended in sharp points. Where its face should be beneath the hood was just blackness, like an empty void. My heart was pounding as I watched this flying creature slowly glide among the trees. After a few more minutes of it screeching and circling the area, it suddenly shot straight up into the night sky and disappeared. I was absolutely terrified by what I had just witnessed. I didn't sleep at all the rest of the night. At first light, I quickly packed up and raced out of those woods, hoping to never encounter whatever that terrifying creature was again. I still have no idea what I saw out there, but it's an experience I'll never forget.